Okay, I'm Gillian. I write urban fantasy, paranormal nonsense, and lately gothic fantasy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you from New Zealand, where it is Saturday, March 13th. Over to Dorian.
Hello, my name is Dorian Graves. Pronouns are they, them. I also write weird or queer urban fantasy series, namely the Deadly Drink series. Yay! Ah, I just released book 2 and I will be reading from that today. Ta-da!
And I'm Michael G. Williams. I write queer science fiction, horror, and urban fantasy. My queer sci-fi detective novel, A Fallen Autumn, won the 2020 Manly Wade Wellman Award. And the first book of my 5-book vampire series, called Perishables, won the Lane Cunningham Award in 2012. And everything I write is about queer people and from queer perspectives, because we see the strange stuff in life. And my pronouns are he, him.
Yeah, got some fun stuff.
Yeah, I have to say, Dorian, I love your titles and your covers. Just that brief glimpse we got of them has me very excited for your reading.
Thank you. Yes, shout out to my cover artist, M. Brackett, who did both the covers. They did the best job I could have asked for. Look at my boys. Look at my boys having an awful time being possessed. It makes me so happy.
Okay. I was going to read the first chapter of The Secretary and the Ghost, which is the first book in my Gothic series of standalones. But I was actually really inspired by hearing Jules's keynote speech. And so I've changed my mind. I'm going to read from The Vampire's Relic, which was the book that made me brave enough to come out and say I'm a lesbian. So I'm just going to jump in. I haven't practiced this. This is pure as off the cuff as you can get when reading from a book. But yeah, we'll just dive in and see how this goes. It was all over the moment they gave their names. The theatre agent looked up from Kitty's bosom and narrowed his eyes at Hester. Kitty O'Hara, Hester Wilson, where have I heard? He released Kitty's hand, rummaging in a drawer. They didn't see what he looked at, but its nature was clear. The smile of a moment before vanished. We've nothing suitable. Blacklisted, Hester said once they were outside in the street. The brute. Next time I see Corky, I'm going to sock him one right in his leering eyes. Nice words for a member of the Anti-Violence League. Kitty pursed her lips, her cheeks red. Taking this last failure personally? Hester put her arm through her friend's. Cheer up, or chin up, as they say here in England. Another moment, and he'd have been eating out of your hand. The rain that had been threatening all day chose now to fall. Typical. All the world was a stage. With this timing, how could the show be anything but a comedy? She spotted an arch over a doorway that promised some shelter. Here. A tall, sinister-looking man stood in the doorway, surrounded by a thick cloud of tobacco. He wore a top hat and a coat that obscured most of him, but his dark beard and sharp eyes stood out. His eyes flicked over them and lingered, struck by the contrast between Kitty's fair complexion and blonde locks and Hester's dark skin and curls hopelessly frizzled by the rain. Whatever he thought of them, he recognized their femininity, bowing as he surrendered the doorway. Hester smiled thanks, but Kitty, to whom such tributes were an everyday occurrence, barely blinked. Why didn't we use aliases? A plaintive note entered her voice. All the great actresses do. Practically no one in the theatre uses their real names. Were we to guess that wretched little cockroach had such influence in the theatre? Perhaps, Kitty said carefully, you shouldn't have threatened to stab him with your hat pin. Hester clenched her fists. After the offer he made you? No woman should be forced to tolerate that. I know, but you didn't need to be so enthusiastic. She wilted, her perfect Cupid's bow of a mouth drooping. We'll have to beg forgiveness, and then he will be even worse. Hester's grip tightened on her companion's arm. Never. We won't get on the stage otherwise. Nonsense. There's the regional troops, and if worse comes to worse, the music halls. We were the most popular two-woman act at the old Olympian Theatre, weren't we? Kitty wilted even further. We came to England to escape the music hall. I suppose, Hester said. There's always the continent. The continent, Kitty shuddered. You know, they don't even speak English over there. She did dismay beautifully. A theatre manager walking past would have taken one look at her flawless complexion, blonde curls, hourglass figure shown to advantage by her gown, ruffled just enough to suggest youth without getting into details, and cast her as a sweet young thing in their next play. It seemed very unfair that there were no theatre managers present, just the angry gentleman in the coat who had stopped smoking to frown at them. We have to do something, Hester said. Our landlady is getting very obnoxious on the subject of rent. Kitty pursed her lips. I'm going to get very obnoxious on the subject of you talking about the rent. Hester grimaced. You're right. We've been in dire straits before and weathered them fine, just as we'll weather this. We're in London. There must be something a girl can do in London. The sinister gentleman cleared his throat. Forgive the intrusion, but I overheard something of your conversation. Am I to understand that you ladies are actresses in search of employment? Hester and Kitty exchanged a startled glance. They turned their attention to the man as one, British accent and stiff with it. On stage, he would have been accused of overdoing it. Hester's gaze lingered on the coat he wore. Quality. Had they somehow stumbled upon the real thing? Kitty seemed to think so, judging from the little flutter she gave. Oh, I hope you don't think us too awful talking shop like this. By no means, said the gentleman. Kitty's instincts with men were generally accurate. I need a woman for a rather delicate task and was just contemplating the impossibility of finding one. It strikes me that the pair of you may be precisely what I need. Hester levelled at him the glare that had stood them in good stead with agents, managers, and the stewards aboard the Marine Duchess. We take cash up front, no cheques, nothing risque, no private performances, and if you try anything funny, we'll have you in court. Ow! Kitty quietly but firmly applied some pressure to Hester's foot. Please excuse my friend. Why don't you tell us what you have in mind somewhere we can sit and talk it over? Getting them out of the rain and the possibility of a free meal, Kitty was definitely the genius of their act. Hester tried not to look excited as the man nodded. An excellent idea. Might I suggest the Criterion? You may, Hester said with feeling. Kitty squeezed her hand in warning. That would be very suitable, Mr. Cross, he said. Lord Cross. He was a gentleman. He made no attempt to talk business until after they'd dealt with tea and cakes, and noticing the speed with which both disappeared, he ordered a second pot and a round of savouries. Hester applied herself happily to the spread. She would never be a beauty. She might at least be fed. Even Kitty's ladylike manners wavered before the prospect of fresh sandwiches and scones. Finally, Hester put down her fork. That was precisely what the doctor ordered. Lord Cross looked at the empty plates. Are American doctors in the habit of prescribing afternoon tea parties, Miss Wilson? Why not? Everyone's got to eat, though they don't often get to eat in places like this. Appetite sated, Hester could appreciate the restaurant. At afternoon tea time, the Criterion hummed. Gowned society ladies taking a break from their afternoon shopping filled most of the tables with the occasional beleaguered husband in attendance. A few courting couples filled in the gaps, a place to be seen and seen, a place to see and be seen. And she, Hester Wilson, was there dining with the Lord. Kitty also seemed conscious of their surroundings. She sat up straight as she spoke, no trace of her native New York burr audible. Lord Cross, you said you have a proposition for us? Yes. Forehead furrowed, Cross lived up to his name. 1 month ago, I was traveling in Europe with my secretary and engaged a residence in Styria for some months. Urgent business called me back to London. Leighton remained at our castle, engaged in research. When I returned a week later, he had vanished. None of our acquaintances knew where he was, and despite extensive investigation, I have not located him. Hester put her cup of tea aside. He didn't just quit. Cross nodded. I have reasons, good reasons, for believing that this is not a simple case of a secretary seeking a change in employment. Among those reasons, Leighton's sister. Leighton invited his sister and her husband to stay with us and was looking forward to their visit. Kitty's eyes swelled with tears. How sad. What does this have to do with us? Hester said. We're actresses. We don't know shorthand. Indeed, Cross said, a trace of irony in his voice. I am not looking for another secretary. Leighton is irreplaceable. His voice held an odd note. Leighton's sister, having a not unnatural interest in her brother's whereabouts, decided to come with me to Styria and continue the search in my stead. Unfortunately, her husband has informed me she can no longer travel, being in a, he looked uncomfortable, delicate condition. Hester's eyes widened. We're to take on the search in her place? Cross's eyes glinted. You catch on quickly, Miss Wilson. I was wary of recruiting a single woman to take on this task, but the pair of you, Miss O'Hara in the guise of Mrs. Jane Goodfellow, Miss Wilson as her companion, strike me as being equal to the task. What is the task? Hester leaned in. To find Mr. Leighton? To listen for news of him and see what you can find of his movements before his disappearance, anything that might give a clue to his intentions. And why can't you do this? Hester gave Cross a fixed stare. Cross shifted in his seat. I have a reputation as a man of stern character. I'm also a magistrate, and while in Styria, acted in that capacity on behalf of an Englishman in difficulties. My authority and allegiance to justice are well known. It is my belief that there may be someone who knows something who would speak to Leighton's sister, but not to me. Naturally, Kitty simpered, being in a position of such responsibility. Is that all? Hester demanded. Cross looked pain. When I first discovered Leighton was missing, I made some hasty remarks about the competence of the Styrian officials and our fellow travellers that did not endear me to them. A charming young woman may well succeed where I have failed. Most men of Hester's acquaintance would follow that compliment with a bow or a leer. That Cross did neither was a mark in his favour. Was he genuine in his desire to find his employee? Will there be danger? Yes, though I intend that you need not face it. Cross folded his fingers together. So far, we have no reason to believe foul play. Leighton is a man of great curiosity. I suspect he has allowed his enthusiasm to lead him into difficulties, but it is the nature of his curiosity that gives me concern. Kitty cocked her head. What do you mean? Leighton's hobby is the occult. He is interested in ghosts, legends of strange creatures, spiritualism. Hester bit down the urge to laugh. Cross evidently took this make-believe seriously. You want us to look for ghosts? And I'm going to stop there. I realize I did everything in the completely wrong order. I should have introduced the vampire's relic and read the blurb before I started my reading. Dorian, Michael, do not follow my example. But I will put the link to the Vampire's Relic in the chat. And if you're interested, you can check out the blurb there. Thank you for letting me share my story with you.
I am already intrigued by these two lasses, I must say.
That was magnificent. I love their no private performances, cash up front, no checks, etc. That really cracked me up. I went to Amazon and bought it while you were immediately after you read that.
Their dynamic is just so good. I love them immediately.
Yeah.
Thank you. I muted myself, so which was probably a good thing because I kind of squealed a bit there, but I really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to both of your readings.
Excellent. All right. Michael, are you going next or am I going next?
I don't know. I'm ready to go, but we don't like have a specific order.
I'm cool either way. If you'd like to, go ahead. Otherwise, I can start on mine.
I'll jump in. I'm also going to do the thing that I forgot that we're supposed to do at the beginning, which is we're supposed to read the welcome. So I'm going to read that real fast because better late than never. Hi, and welcome to Rainbow Space Magic Con 2.0. This is the us reading our books panel. Before our panelists introduce themselves, or maybe after, then here are a few logistics. First, there's a chat at the bottom of your screen that you can use to talk to each other and share recommendations. If you'd like to submit a question to the panel, please put it in the Q&A bar. We're more likely to see it there. We will address audience questions in the second half of the panel or at the end, but feel free to write them as you think of them. After the panel, we can keep the conversation going in the Discord chat. A link will be posted. Also, the organizers would like me to remind you that you can buy RSM merchandise at their Redbubble merch store. All proceeds from that will be divided among our feature nonprofits. We also encourage you to contribute to our featured organizations directly. Let us know if you do so we can keep a tally on how much we've raised. The organizations we're supporting this year are Lambda Literary, Trans Media Watch, Shade Literary Arts, and Glad Day Lit. Also, our keynote speaker, Joel Gomez, asked us to feature BLF Press. A link will be posted in the chat for you to learn more about these organizations. So, without further ado, back into our presentations. So, I'm going to read from this. Thank you for the reminder. A Fallen Autumn. It's a queer sci-fi detective novel published by Falstaff Books, and it won the 2020 Manly Wellman Award from the North Carolina Speculative Fiction Foundation, which is awarded to the best speculative fiction novel by the judgment of their jury, published by a writer in North Carolina. So I'll read the blurb first, because that has never occurred to me to do at a reading. So thank you, Gillian. Welcome to the last of the great flying cities. It's 9172 YE, year of the Empire, and the future has forgotten its past. Soaring miles over the earth, Autumn, the sole surviving flying city, is filled to the brim with the manifold forms of humankind, from human plus floor models to the oppressed and disfranchised underclasses doing their dirty work, and every imaginable variation between. Valerius Bakum is a washed-up private eye and street hustler scraping by in Autumn. Late on his rent, fetishized and reviled for his imperfect genetics, stuck in the quicksand of his own heritage, Valerius is trying desperately to wrap up his too short life when a mythical relic of humanity's fog-shrouded past walks in and hires him to do one last job. What starts out as Valerius just taking a stranger's money quickly turns into the biggest and most dangerous mystery he's ever tried to crack, and Valerius is running out of time to solve it. Now Autumn's abandoned history and the monsters and heroes that adorn it are emerging from the shadows to threaten the few remaining things Valerius holds dear. Can the burned-out detective navigate the labyrinth of lies and maze of blind faith around him to save the city of Autumn from its greatest myth and deadliest threat? So that's the deal. When I wrote this book, I basically wanted to write, what if, like Raymond Chandler or the Rockford Files had also been a science fiction property? And so this is what you get. The part that I'm going to read is from the end of chapter 5 and beginning of chapter 6. Excuse me. And at this point in the story, Valerius has been hired by a client named Alejandro. Alejandro is, we would call him an android, but in their culture, they are referred to as golems. They, in Valerius's time, are these relics of the ancient past. Valerius's time period knows that golems were built by technologically gifted ancients, but they have long since lost the ability to make new androids themselves. What Valerius's culture excels at is biotechnology, genetic engineering, anything like that. And the vast majority of people are genetically engineered and designed from birth. It's also really easy for most people to go just get enhancements if they feel like it, or go get something changed if they feel like it. Valerius, however, is one of a very small minority of people referred to as artisanal humans. They are people who got made the old-fashioned way by people who did not know better. And they're artisanal humans are kind of kept out of society. Legally speaking, it's a little iffy that he's even allowed to live in the place that he lives because it's a little too cosmopolitan and modern. Mostly they're forced to live on reservations as a sort of backup copy of the human genome, just in case the larger culture gets a little too risque with the things it tries to stretch the human genome to do. They want to keep 100,000 or so regular people around at all times so that they can tap their genetics if they need to in case of an emergency. So Valerius kind of finds himself stuck in society. He's sort of technically in the midpoint of the social strata. Really, what he experiences is that almost everyone he meets either thinks that he's sort of an embarrassing throwback to an earlier time, or they fetishize him as this sort of idealized better past. He doesn't like either of those things, and so he has spent most of his life trying to spit in the eye of society. And in that sense, I felt like it was a good way to represent the modern queer experience of there being sports bars full of straight people who watch RuPaul's Drag Race. So I don't know, that's kind of what I was trying to go for. But at this point in the story, Valerius has been hired by his client, a golem named Alejandro, and Valerius has had a very frustrating day trying to investigate this and has gone out and gotten himself stinking drunk, and then went to watch the sunrise in the middle of the cruising part of the biggest city park. I settled down in my branch, the weight of my failing body suddenly greater than I remembered it being on the hike up. Exhaustion tied itself to all my corners and sank. Exhaustion from the night spent drinking, from my liver working overtime to deal with all that booze, from my walk across the city's landscape, from too little sleep gotten on a lumpy couch in a cold office I could no longer afford. The pink edge of the sky turned red and then yellow, and just as a tiny crescent of the sun himself started to crest over the four barrier and golden spotlights shot westward between the buildings of my beautiful city, I heard rustling from below as someone approached quietly, but not stealthily, the footfalls of a person who didn't want to disturb their own reverie by stomping around. It was Alejandro walking into the clearing at the climax of the fuck trail, and he was turning to face the sunrise and closing his eyes as the rays struck him all at once. I stayed where I was, quiet as I could be, my gaze shifting back and forth between the absurdly beautiful light show on the horizon and that same light playing across Alejandro's simultaneously too smooth and too human features. Do you often come here in the morning? His voice was quiet, but it carried, and anyway, he didn't exactly have a lot of competition to be heard. Alejandro turned to face me, or at least in my direction, despite me thinking I was hidden. I do, he went on. I come here to watch the sunrise at least once a week. It, walked closer to me. He didn't seem to know exactly where I was, though it occurred to me he was just pretending in order to be polite. I couldn't stand the thought of that. Couldn't stand the thought of being pandered to by a machine designed to make me like him in the first place. So I half jumped and half tumbled right out of the tree and onto the ground, the alcohol cushioning me for the moment against the worst of the pain of impact. I could tell when I landed, I was a little thinner in the bones than 6 months before. It was the first time I felt frail. I love to come here, I said from where I lay, still crumpled awkwardly on the ground, my coat twisted up around me and my hat fallen to the side. And I love to come here. I rolled over onto my side and then up onto one leg, then another, standing unsteadily and half-heartedly dusting myself off. I hoped to bother him with that. I wanted to offend the delicate sensibilities I associated with these timeless, semi-legendary creatures of metal and soft eyes and room temperature false flesh. Alejandro walked over to just outside of arm's reach and looked at me with those eyes, narrowed in sympathy, a surplus of forgiveness for whatever dumb idea resulted in me being here at the literal crack of dawn. "You're dying, aren't you?" he said. I blinked. How did everybody know? Did the Church of the Infinite Upward Spiral of the Double Helix tattoo it onto my forehead with the last time I tried to bribe treatments out of somebody? "We get used to noticing things," he said in response to my frown. "Golems, I mean. We spend enough time around people to detect patterns." He tried to look a little self-conscious about it, and it almost succeeded. I figured he did the best he could do with the false facial musculature his designers gave him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm dying," I said. "Apologies are a waste of time." "So is anger," Alejandro countered. "No, it isn't," I said. "Sometimes anger is the closest thing I can find to a reason to live. There are mornings when the only thing getting me out of bed is the desire to piss someone off." "What about the other days? What gets you out of bed when you aren't angry?" He looked sad, like he'd heard these sorts of antics before, and maybe he had. Maybe he'd been around since before the ancients popped their big balloon. Maybe he'd had 100,000 humans tell him all about how sad they were. I hated them too. Well, the same thing getting anybody else out of bed. The rent, a cup of coffee, and the hope I'll maybe get laid if I'm lucky. I sure as shit don't do it for the home-cooked meals. And that was when he kissed me, and I kissed him, and the two of us did something halfway between fucking and making love right there in the middle of down preserves while the sun came up on autumn and a virtuously busy morning wound its springs without us. The sun was over the trees at the southeastern edge of the sloped opening in the forest when I awoke. It was the sun that woke me, actually, its rays on my face, the flicker of shadow and light as it played across my closed eyes. I was half dressed, but my shoes were off, my feet bare, and my coat was spread over me in lieu of a blanket. My shirt was somewhere, probably. I wasn't wearing it anyway, and my eyes weren't open yet, but I could feel it was nearby, the way you can sense an old dog by your chair or a former lover on the opposite side of an otherwise perfectly nice party. My back was curled against something firm and supporting, and I felt gentle fingers stroke the tufts of silvery black at my temples. Hematite, a man told me once. I would always love him a little for saying that. My hair there wasn't yet gray, but no longer black, and when it was wet, it looked like hematite. And he said it like that meant something deep and significant and mystical I didn't understand. Having someone's fingers run through it felt good, though. It felt like a happy memory, like something I didn't expect would happen much anymore, if it ever really happened in the first place. That simple touch was a comfort to me. It's the most minor thing, and for that reason, the most missed when it's gone. I don't go long stretches without being touched, but it had been a while between caresses. This was that, a caress and more. Not exactly sexual, but not exactly platonic. It was that happy in between we call intimate. I made myself vulnerable to other men and they themselves to me more times than I can count in my too short life. It didn't always work out, though, that my usual flavor of street trade would show basic human kindness in return for mine. None of that mattered, though. Those guys were long gone. Right that second, someone was running his fingers through my half-asleep hair, and it was intimate, and they were kind. I was vulnerable, and that was okay. For a few moments, I wasn't dying, and I wasn't scared. I wasn't lonely, and I wasn't alone. The sun felt good, and the breeze through the branches was the sound of Gaia herself telling me to go back to sleep. And I thought for a moment I might be okay with dying fairly soon if I got to wake up like this every morning for the rest of my life. "Okay," I said. I didn't move and I didn't open my eyes because I wasn't quite ready for the moment to go away even as I showed it the door. "You want something, so tell me what it is, because if I say yes, I may not have much time to hold at my end of the bargain." And that's my reading.
I love your character, and his voice is so strong. Thank you for reading that.
Thank you.
As a Chandler fan, I could definitely hear his influence in some of those lines, especially that description of the sunset. Like, it's easy to do the Chandler hard-nosed humor, but you managed to do his poetry as well, which very few people do.
Well,
But
thank you. I am extremely flattered by that. Thank you.
yeah, no, I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for sharing it with us.
That, by the way, just got released as an audiobook from Scribd Audio, so it's out on like Apple and Amazon and Audible and all that stuff as well. And I really want to find out how to get in touch with the narrator, because I don't know, because like it happened through a bunch of like intermediary deal people, and he's so good. He's like so much better at reading it than I am, and I am really like high on how good that audiobook production is. So thank you very much, and thanks for listening.
Delightful. All right. Let me get my book out. Oh, blurb first. So, Corpses and Cognac is the second book in the Deadly Drink series. I did try to make it as accessible as possible to new readers, but if you want to read the first book, I hold it right. Bones and Bourbon is also available. Ta-da! So, blurb. An ancient leviathan lies buried under the town of Arcata, California, which isn't a problem until its head goes missing and its ghost threatens to destroy the entire town. Sounds like a typical case for the possessed hairdresser Retz and cursed bounty hunter Jared, the half-Holdra Gallows brothers. But the case soon turns complicated with a string of disappearances, a madcap carnival promising eternal bliss, and a motorcycle gang of minotaurs plotting against the mysterious strangers that are neither human nor monster. Lucky for the Gallows brothers, they have staunch allies. Or at least they have Nallum, the necromancer ghost who borrows Retz's body, and Ferris, Jared's daredevil boyfriend, coming to grips with his new unlife as a fairy. Everyone else they thought of as friends show a different face in the funhouse mirrors, and old foes beg to be saved from the happiest place out of this world. This case will shake Retz and Jared to their cores, forcing them to question everything they know about themselves and their loved ones. It'll be a struggle to save the day with their bodies and minds intact, which means it's the perfect time for a drink. Sit back and raise a glass. The Gallows brothers ride again. Yay. Alrighty. So that said, I was just going to go ahead and jump on in to read from chapter 1. I timed myself earlier. I'll probably hit right at that 10-minute mark or a little over, so forgive me if I'm a little over. I hadn't planned to be run over by a Minotaur's motorcycle. If I'd been standing in the middle of the road, being ambushed by a motorcycle would have made some sense. But this happened deep in the woods, perhaps a mile off a dirt road only frequented by logging trucks, in the last dregs of summer when falling leaves are fragile and flammable in equal measure. I had beasts in these woods on my hit list, but not the Minotaur. I reeked of blood from my own wounds, and also of cheap whiskey because I'd upended half a bottle over my head to deter my intended mark, which certainly hadn't been a Minotaur, from attacking me. One might ask, what kind of idiot has instincts that scream, grab the motorcycle and throw it into a goddamn tree instead of getting out of the way? The answer is me, Jared Gallows. What? The Minotaur croaked in the second he and his bike were airborne. The ever-loving ship! The crash of his impact shook the forest. The hide behind I'd just fought, my actual intended target, twitched at my feet, scraping foot-long claws against the forest floor. The silver manacles I'd clasped around its wrists were the only reason it didn't use the surprise Minotaur attack as an opportunity to flee or to escape out of sight and stab me in the back as its name suggested. I should have ignored the ambush and lugged the hide behind to the car, but I'm a paranormal investigator by trade because I'm always too damn curious for my own good. I grabbed one of my pistols and kept it aimed on the Minotaur as I approached. I waited to speak until the bull-headed man sat up and stared at me, terror in his eyes and splinters of bark sticking into his skull. You've got 2 seconds to explain. The Minotaur patted the ground at his side for a weapon. He found only crumpled metal. Forgive me, Lord Nallum. I was, well, you see. He cleared his throat. I mistook that hide behind for, well, you until it was too late. Appearances can be deceiving, right? His laugh was closer to a pitiful bray. I wanted to pretend I'd heard him wrong, but I wasn't drunk enough. Right, which'll be why you'll be more surprised if you actually find him. My family bore plenty of curses, but I wasn't the one forced to be the vessel for the ancient eldritch asshole known as Nallum. Yeah, I guess it. Wait, you're not him? The Minotaur bolted to hooves and took in our surroundings with rapid, wild eyes. But you're a Holderkind. I was told to look for a Holderkind, one with what did she call it? A malicious aura. The Minotaur looked down at me, then at the hide behind, a bristling ball of fur that seemed to be crafted from shadows with glowing coals of hate for eyes and long gangly limbs that ended in even longer claws. Me again. Well, shoot. I must have muddled your auras together, huh? I nodded, but in all honesty, I had no idea. Other supernatural beings, like the super strong and hollow bodied Holders on my mother's side of the family, were taught to sense each other through some sixth sense from a young age. I'd never had the knack. Otherwise, the Minotaur wouldn't have been able to ambush me. The Minotaur buried his face in his hands with a mournful moo. The rest of the herd's never gonna let me live this down. But if you're not Nallum. I considered leaving him there. Nothing good ever came of dealing with Nallum, and I should have spared him from the torture that plagued my family for years. Plus, the hide behind kept hissing, and I feared it might try to break away soon. I offered the Minotaur a hand instead. If you're that desperate to see him, follow me. The Minotaur took the offering, so I pulled him to his feet, even though he was almost twice my size. Jared Gallows, paranormal investigator, grab what's left of your bike. While minotaurs may look human from a distance, they've still got a bovine head and hooves, plus a layer of hide over all that muscle. This one was light brown and dressed in motorcycle leathers, liberally covered in patches and spikes. The only thing throwing the picture off was his puppy-like demeanor. His giant arms, which I swore were as long as I was tall, scooped up the motorcycle parts like they were little more than a fallen bag of groceries. My name's Bolton, he said, and I really appreciate this. I've got a special message for Nallum, you see. An old friend needs his help. I scoffed at that. That or hope he's feeling sociable. I dragged the hide behind after me as I led Bolton toward where we'd parked the car. My job was to capture the local pair of hide behinds before they could mate and spawn. Problem was, the hide behinds were fast and prone to backstabbing, so much that almost no one ever saw their faces and lived. It was rare for them to drop their guard, even around their own kind. I had a hard time looking at the one I'd caught. It was like staring at a gaping hole in the universe, albeit one that kept trying to claw me, even with the manacles searing its wrists. I asked Bolton as we walked. Tell me, what do you know about Nallum? Bolton hummed as he thought, almost loud enough to drown out the sound of his hooves crunching leaves. He has power over bones, that's the big thing. Living and dead. I was told to never shake hands with him. Oh, he's ancient too, made lots of enemies. But he's loyal deep down to his friends and his dreams. That last part struck an anger in me I worked hard to keep buried. You know, I helped him kill his own ex-wife after he'd helped her capture me and my partner to almost sell us, of course. They must not have been friends. I guess all I really know is my entire town's in trouble if we can't get his help. And if that happens, things will be bad enough that even the humans will notice. I swore under my breath. Human minds can't comprehend the supernatural. Their minds twist and warp to explain away anything monstrous or magical that they see. There were rare exceptions. My father was one. My boyfriend had been another. But if a situation were bad enough that multiple humans would notice, would be forced to comprehend something their minds shouldn't be exposed to? No, I couldn't think about that now. There was the car up ahead, a Mercury Grand Marquis that had once been red, but spray painted black with the words Crusher 000 painted in white along its sides. I'd gotten it from a destruction derby for the low price of exorcising a ghost. It was a tank of a car, but to my disappointment, it was currently vacant. The others hadn't made it back yet. This is your ride? Sure is. I popped open the trunk and tossed the hide behind in. I'd spent most of my last job's check lining it with silver for containing creatures like this hide behind. Maybe I could get more jobs rescuing supernatural beings this way instead of extermination gigs. Feel free to leave your motorcycle parts here. I don't think anyone else will come by to steal them. Bolton did so. Then for some reason he knelt next to the Merc and bowed his head as if in prayer. He said when he stood, "It's certainly well loved. May it continue to guard you well." I offered my thanks, confused as I was, and we returned to the woods. When my brother, or Nallum, is out fighting, he's easy to find. All one has to do is follow where the bones should be, but aren't. Layers of decaying skin and muscle lying flat on the ground, torn so the skeletons could be freed. Holes where long buried remains have been unearthed through sheer force of will. I felt a dull ache in my jaw as he reached out with his powers from afar and tried to pull, only to remember that he hadn't killed me yet. The last days of summer were warm enough that the corpses stank as they rotted, nestled by decaying leaves and flies gorging themselves before the autumn chill arrived. I heard a crack up ahead. Couldn't tell if branch or bone. Undergrowth rustled behind us. Bolton stumbled to a stop. I think there's another one of those things behind us. He balled his meaty hands into fists the size of my head. I also shifted into a fighting stance. No guns. Didn't want to risk killing my targets. Are you actually sensing it this time, or is this just wishful thinking? Bolton sniffed the air. This time, I bet my... Whatever it was, he would have won that bet. A lanky-limbed bristle form darted out of the trees behind us and pounced onto the Minotaur's back, digging its claws deep into his hide. Bolton bellowed in pain. He swung a wide hook, but the hide behind blurred as it dragged its claws through his flesh, and all he hit was solid earth. Before I could react, two more figures burst out of the foliage. The first was tall and skinny enough that his bones jutted through his near-white skin, stumbling toward us like a newborn foal taking its first wobbling steps. The other was a bear. Not all of it, just the skeleton and a couple stubborn scraps of rotting flesh that wouldn't fall off its bones. It also, for some reason, had 6 legs and a set of horns. Hey, perfect timing. I've almost got this hide behind, but it just occurred to me. How am I supposed to handcuff the darn thing? Am I supposed to cuff it to me? Or can I, cuff it to this elk bear I made? The only person who would even think to ask that was Red Scallows, my lanky little brother with a fascination for magical skeletal taxidermy. In fact, he was so proud of his creation that it took another scream from the Minotaur for him to actually notice the fight. Oh, shit. Who's our new friend here? And that is where I'll call that.
That was so much fun.
That was fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just say, there was so many things about that I enjoyed, but for some reason, Bolton's mournful moo really got me.
Yes. The fact that he's like got kind of a doofy voice just really like brought the character to life in a way that I would not have expected. Had somebody said you're going to hear a reading with a minotaur in it, I would have expected like a big, like brutish voice, and instead we get like so much more interesting of a character. I don't know. I love that.
Thank you.
I think Bolton is going to be hilarious.
I'll admit he was one that I like brought in offhand in an earlier draft, and he was just so darn entertaining. I'm like, oh no, he's taking screen time. Oh no, now he's here at the very beginning of the book from the start. Okay, all right, we just have this Minotaur. Okay, cool. There's more Minotaurs later in the book. Awesome.
Fantastic. We have 2 questions in the Q&A, and the first one is for Michael. I'm going to read it out, and Michael, you can answer it. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, this is from J. Scott Coatsworth. Hi. The future has forgotten its past. Michael, that's a fantastic tagline. Agreed. How did you come up with it?
Thank you. So like 2 days before publication, my publisher emailed me and said, oh, we need a tagline. And I had no time to think about it. Nothing. It had not occurred to me that the book needed a tagline. This was the 6th novel that I had published, and I'd never come up with a tagline for one before. It just had never occurred to me. So I just like real quick, like in 5 minutes, just hammered out like 12 different taglines, and 11 of them were real garbage. But when that one came out, then I was like, well, that one might actually work. And so when I emailed it to him, I put that one in bold, and I said at the bottom, like, I think this is the one, but I'm just playing with words here. I don't know, just like you listen to them, say them out loud and see what you think. And ultimately, that's the way that I come up with a lot of marketing stuff. I say it out loud. And if it sounded good, then it sounded good. And that one just happened to work. I like the alliteration of future and forgotten.
That is very cool. So our next question is from Vanessa. Oldie but a goodie, what inspired y'all to write your stories, the ones you read today? So let's start with Dorian.
Well, briefly on the Gallows Brothers and the Deadly Drink series. Originally, I had written them for a comic, and they were supposed to be side characters, but they kept taking more and more screen time. So I went, all right, fine you attention hogs, get your own book series. So they did. And Corpses and Cognac was a really interesting case because I had clear ideas for book 1 and for book 3, but I'm like, how do I bridge these together? And since its earliest inceptions, it's had some of its elements like a carnival theme, mostly because I started plotting for it at a convention down in the Bay Area where there's like loud music, there were aerials going on, and I'm just like, I need to put this in a book. But I don't know, it ended up just being a lot of elements that did not seem to go together, and then they got tied together with themes of identity, because this is a book where a lot of characters question, well, who am I and why am I like this, and why is that okay with me even when other people say I should be something else? So it ended up being a big book that has a lot of reflection, some of it being very personal, but then there's also minotaurs and haunted carnivals and stuff. So it's fun but deep, but minotaurs.
I think fun but deep, but minotaurs should be your author tagline, because that is...
Yeah, that's a great tagline.
Thanks. Oh, also, it's set in Arcata, California, because I toured there a number of times for college, and I'm like, man, this is such a cool, funky little town. I need to put it in a book. Wait a minute, I know where I can put minotaurs and stuff. Hey.
I have to interrupt very quickly. Michael, who is the amazing feline? Who is
That's
the
Rupert Giles. He is one of our 4 cats, and Rupert he's amazing.
Please tell Rupert we love him.
Oh,
Yes.
I will. He knows, but he also likes to hear it. How about you, Gillian?
Oh, okay. So, for a long time, the first book that I wrote that was published, Thorns and Fangs, you can kind of tell from that expansive man chest on the cover there, this is a gay romance. And my next series that I wrote, Deep Magic, also had a gay couple sort of at its center. And for a long time, I felt safe writing gay romance. And I didn't think too deeply about why I felt safe. I think it was like when I discovered the world of fan fiction. I was like, oh my gosh, here's some place that I feel safe and accepted and included. And I did not think too hard about why that was. Writing gay romance allowed me to tell, queer stories and give people the romances and happy endings and adventures that, they deserved. But, and they were stories that I needed to tell and wanted to tell, but I didn't question too hard about why that was. And then, I was in Christchurch with a couple of friends, and we're just 2 other friends, and we're just met to share critiques of our stories. And one of those friends looked up at me and the other person there and said, "Hey, do you realize we've got an entirely queer critique group here?" And I'd never applied the word queer to myself, but that was like a light bulb moment. I was just like, oh, yeah, I feel this is me. And so I started, instead of shying away from like the scary things, started looking more deeply at why I wanted to tell these stories. And took me a really long time to realize, oh, okay, so I'm not straight in any way. And that writing gay romance allowed me to kind of explore my queerness, while also it's very obvious, I hope, that I am not a gay man. So I had that safety that no one would look at my characters and think, oh yeah, this is Gillian. So writing The Vampire's Relic, which has a female couple at the center, it was kind of me being able to finally say, hey, I'm lesbian, I'm happy, I don't care if people know that I'm lesbian, because that is just part of me. And the other thing that about The Vampire's Relic, well, I could have written many lesbian romances. As this time I've got 2, and there's a few others sort of in the works. But the reason this is The Vampire's Relic is because of J. Sheridan Le Fanu, who 14 years before Dracula came out wrote Camilla, which is an amazing vampire story. It is so creepy to us reading now with all of the vampire lore. It is beyond obvious that Camilla is a vampire and Laura is her victim. But as you read the story and the characters have no idea what's going on, you're just kind of really gripped by it. I also read this when I was like a teenager in a very Christian household, and lesbian was not a word that ever got used. So I think Camilla was like really central to me finding myself. So The Vampire's Relic kind of bridges my self-discovery while also going back to those wonderful tropey vampire goodness. Kind of, it's Camilla, except that the Camilla doesn't die at the end. So yeah.
That is delightful. And also,
Totally.
I'm so glad that your book also helped you with, coming out and discovering about yourself. Because, yeah, my books kind of did that too. Is writing the first book, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm queer, and one of the main characters is asexual, and one of the others, Jared, that I just read, is a trans man. And in part of writing them, I'm like, oh wait, I'm also on the ace spectrum, and I'm not cis. I'm some shade of non-binary, and it's wonderful how the act of writing and creating can help us learn that about ourselves. It's so neat.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, because when you mentioned identity, I was like, I have to ask Dorian about that later, and you've answered my question. So Michael, your turn.
So before this series, before the autumn series about Valerius, I had just finished a 5-book vampire series about a vampire who grew up in the mountains of Western North Carolina and was a gay man in the 40s and had been so accustomed to being told that that made him a monster that he decided to become a monster to show them what a monster was. And so his queerness is really tied into what drove him to become a vampire, and why when he got offered that, why he said yes. And I wanted to still write about a queer character, and I still wanted to write about queerness, but I wanted to write a setting where queerness wasn't a big deal, where it still mattered to the main character, but it wasn't his queerness was not what made him different, and I wanted to depict a future in which it's possible for a queer character to have problems that are not the fact that they're queer. So I love hard-boiled detective noir stuff, and I'd never taken a crack at writing that. And in that vampire series, I'd written a whole bunch of genre mashups, where each book was, one is vampires and superheroes, one of them is vampires and rednecks, whatever. So I wanted to get to play with a genre that I had not gotten to play with yet. I think ultimately every writer just kind of wants to write more of what they've loved reading, and there is nothing wrong with that. And so I love reading detective novels, and I wanted to do that, but I wanted to do that without the gross toxic masculinity stuff from the detective genre. Really what I wanted to write was Rockford Files if it were a sci-fi television show, but that's me demonstrating that I am approximately 700 years old. So I came up with, some friends and I played a tabletop role-playing game called Microscope. And Microscope it is a game, but it's a game about building the world of a game. And so each turn in Microscope, you either, whoever is in charge of that turn asks a question about the world. And then either you just explicitly answer it, or everyone role plays a scene that ultimately answers that question. And by doing so, you sort of define the boundaries of the world and what kind of world is it and what features does it have and what societies are in it and things like that. And we played a game of Microscope years ago that created the world of Autumn. And at the end of that game, I said, wow, I really want to write a novel there. So I decided, well, I really want to write a detective novel and I really want to write something in this autumn setting. I'll just do this as National Novel Writing Month and get it out of my system. And really loved writing that book and just could not stop thinking about it after I got done with it. And so a couple of years later, picked it back up. And the more that I worked on revising it and trying to flesh it out and build it out from, barely crossing the 50,000 word line to something a little longer and a little more detailed, the more I realized that I was yet again putting my own history in this character, because I grew up in a remote part of Appalachia and in a family that I do not agree with, and we don't really talk or get along. And Valerius does not think highly of the people who made him more or less by accident. And he ran away from the reservation to go live in the big city. And when I was 12, I distinctly remember my mother saying, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "A city boy." And that was not a fun or welcome answer. So, just like getting to talk about a lot of things that I like talking about in terms of like queerness, religion, the queer place in society, the way that we're simultaneously fetishized and reviled right now. And it's very strange for us, I think. Like this is one of the strangest times for the queer experience. And especially as even within the queer communities, we realize that queer is like a much bigger, broader umbrella term, and it's a much bigger tent than a lot of people are accustomed to it being. And we need to welcome everybody in who wants to be in, because strength in numbers. And at the same time that we feel like a lot safer in society, we also face a ton of new restrictions. It's 2021, we're in the third month of 2021, and there are already a record number of anti-trans bills filed in state legislatures across the United States. So that's something that, the queer community is constantly under attack, and it is on us to defend our brothers and sisters and siblings in the queer communities from that world. So I wanted to get to talk about like the importance of all the queer stuff, but I also wanted to get to talk about a setting where not everybody cared that he was queer, and like that wasn't his defining problem, but that was something that would be a feature of who he was. That's the longest winded answer ever. I'm so sorry.
It makes perfect sense to me. I think what makes sort of motivates a lot of indie authors is to tell stories that are outside kind of big five publishing view. Like if you are gay, you only have one story, and that's about how hard your life is. But readers don't want that. If that's their experience, they know they want more than that, because we are more than our genders and sexualities and everything else. They are just part of us, not all of us. And it is really brilliant to see you using storytelling to share that truth.
Mm-hmm.
Since Michael did such a brilliant job of doing the introduction at the start, I'm going to do a less brilliant job of letting everyone know that the opening night party is beginning now on Discord, I believe.
Raise the roof, everybody.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have to go and babysit now, so I will not be taking part, but I hope the rest of you have a brilliant time.
Yes, I have to go and eat dinner now, but
Oh
thanks,
yeah,
y'all.
food, sustenance, keeping the
Yeah.
more flesh vessel going. But yes, we hope to see some of you or all of you who are able to attend at the opening night party. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Thank you for attending and joining us. This was a delightful reading. I definitely need to read all of these books like now. How
For
can I read
real.
once, everybody?
Yep. Okay.
Bye. It was lovely meeting y'all.
Bye.